Facsimile 3 has always been the most neglected of the three facsimiles in the Book of Abraham. Unfortunately, most of what has been said about this facsimile is seriously wanting at best and highly erroneous at worst. This lamentable state of affairs exists because the basic Egyptological work on Facsimile 3 has not been done, and much of the evidence lies neglected and unpublished in museums. Until we understand what the Egyptians understood by this scene, we have no hope of telling whether what Joseph Smith said about them matches what the Egyptians thought about them. I have no intention of explaining Facsimile 3 at this time. I rather desire to debunk a few persistent myths circulating about Facsimile 3. Facsimile 3 came from the middle of a long roll belonging to a man by the name of Hor, who was the son of Osoroeris and Hibois. The first part of the roll contained the man's name and titles, followed by Facsimile 1, followed by the so-called Book of Breathings made by Isis, 4 of the 6 columns of which have been preserved. Facsimile 3 came next, followed by another text. The only portions of which have been preserved are the maddeningly elliptical opening words, beginning of the book of. Although this papyrus has been assumed to date to the end of the 1st century AD, the reasoning behind such dating has been convincingly challenged, and it has now been dated on the basis of the names and titles of the owner to the first half of the 2nd century BC. It has normally been assumed that the facsimiles of the Book of Abraham were drawn by Abraham himself. This assumption is too simplistic for what we know of the traditions of manuscript illustration. In Egypt, iconographic traditions, such as the canon of proportions, are modified from time to time, the same tradition even varying in artistic media from time to time. The Egyptians even changed the text vignettes are associated with, which I will demonstrate later. So while the text of the Book of Abraham comes from Abraham's day, the style of the facsimiles of the Book of Abraham reflects the date of the manuscript rather than the date of the text. Egypt of the Greco-Roman period is in some ways substantially different from the earlier periods of the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom that most Egyptologists specialize in. For one thing, the language in use in the Greco-Roman period is Demotic, a very different language from the classical Egyptian that most Egyptologists know. Furthermore, most of the Egyptologists who have commented on the Joseph Smith papyri have not had training in the Greco-Roman period to which the manuscripts date. In fact, one Demotic scholar bids us note how few Demoticists there are in the world, how few contemporary Egyptologists extend their interests past Tutankhamun and the New Kingdom flowering. In the past, Demoticists have been considered almost suspect to mainstream Egyptologists. If most Egyptologists think that those who study material from this time period are suspect, they obviously think even less of the material under study. Since everyone insists that the facsimiles come from the Greco-Roman period, the principal evidence to explain the facsimiles should also come from the Greco-Roman period, even if most Egyptologists lack the necessary training in that time period. Since Egyptology comprises 4,000 years of history of all facets of a complex civilization, no Egyptologist can be a specialist in all facets of this civilization. The opinion of an Egyptologist who has no interest or ability in the time period of the Joseph Smith papyri is largely irrelevant. It is maintained that Facsimile 3 presents a constantly recurring scene in Egyptian literature, best known from the 125th chapter of the Book of the Dead. It represents the judgment of the dead before the throne of Osiris. This notion, so far as I have been able to trace it, was originally suggested both by William Matthews Flinders Petrie and James Henry Breasted. The fullest attempt to demonstrate this was promulgated by Gerald and Sandra Tanner based on comparisons made by Grant Heward with 2 judgment scenes in Papyrus British Museum's 3135 and Papyrus British Museum 3154. The numbering of the vignettes of the chapters of the Book of the Dead comes from a papyrus published in 1842 by Richard Lepsius. This papyrus, then and now in Turin, dates from the Ptolemaic period. The earliest copies of the Book of the Dead date from the 18th dynasty, about 1,300 years earlier, and are much different, although the same numbering system is still used. The Book of the Dead 125 first appeared early in the reign of the 18th dynasty pharaoh Thutmose III. It had no vignette. The earliest papyrus copies of the Book of the Dead had no vignettes of any sort. Vignettes on Book of the Dead papyri did not appear until after the reign of Thutmose III, following an iconographic movement that took place during his reign, when many of the cultic scenes, such as the depiction of the divine royal birth, tree goddesses and their cult, the Opet festival, the canonical list of the 9 blows, and the presentation of Maat, appear first in the iconography. The judgment scene does occur in the 18th dynasty, but when it originally appeared, it was associated with Book of the Dead 30b, not Book of the Dead 125. The connection of the Book of the Dead 125 with the Judgment of the Dead appears first in manuscripts that have been dated, although not securely, to the reign of Amenhotep II. But there is no consistent association of the vignette depicting the Judgment of the Dead with Book of the Dead 125 until after the 19th dynasty. Taken as a whole, only a minority of 18th dynasty vignettes associate the judgment scene with Book of the Dead 125, and almost as many associate the judgment scene with Book of the Dead 30b. Book of the Dead 30b is a famous text which reads as follows: O my heart of my mother, O my heart of my mother, O my heart of my forms, do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not oppose me in the council. Do not go against me in the presence of the keeper of the balance. In later times, the vignette associated with Book of the Dead 30b was a picture of a heart scarab. But the heart scarab occurs in the 18th dynasty only rarely. The association of the Judgment of the Dead with Book of the Dead 30b makes sense, as Book of the Dead 30b mentions the judgment and the weighing of the heart, whereas Book of the Dead 125 does not. After the 26th dynasty, the Judgment of the Dead vignette is consistently attached to Book of the Dead 125 in copies of the Book of the Dead. From this, we can conclude that the vignettes can be used for texts other than those with which they were originally associated. Thus, the argument usually advanced by critics of the Book of Abraham that because a vignette from the text is similar to a vignette from a funerary text and must therefore retain its full funerary meaning is an invalid argument. This is quite telling, as both Facsimile 1 and Facsimile 3 are assumed to belong to the Book of Breathings made by Isis because they accompany the text in the Joseph Smith papyri. Yet the contemporarily parallel texts of the Book of Breathings made by Isis belonging to members of the same family have different vignettes associated with them. Instead of a scene like Facsimile 3, most Book of Breathings made by Isis show a man with his hands raised in adoration to a cow. This would indicate that the facsimiles of the Book of Abraham do not belong to the Book of Breathings. The problem with the theory that Facsimile 3 is the vignette from Book of the Dead 125 can most readily be shown by a single quotation from the latest known copy of the Book of the Dead, written in Demotic in AD 63. This Book of the Dead has no vignettes. Instead, it has a written description of the vignettes, demonstrating clearly what elements the Egyptians thought were essential to the judgment scene. The 42 gods, Lord of the Spirit above the Hall of the Two Truths, a figure of Hathor, Lady of the Underworld, carrying a wasp scepter, protecting the man, while the 2 arms of the scale are straight and Thoth is on the left, to the right of it's broken, while Horus speaks and Anubis grasps it on the side. Hold it. We're off on our slides.
Okay. Hey, we're on the slides, so you want to back up to any?
Why don't we back up to 3 slides here, and back up, keep backing up on the text. Right here. Okay.
Is this the right slide?
That's the slide that should start here. Let me. Okay. All right, this one, why don't you just leave this one on until this change?
Leave this one on?
Yeah, leave the one that's on here until
this
one is just to start this one here.
Okay, is this the same?
Yeah, this is the same.
Those are the two same. Okay, that's where, because I read these as two separate.
Just leave this one on and start here and then start changing here.
Right
Yeah,
here?
that's the one up there right now.
Okay, so it's on, and then when
So
I get to
just
here,
then you change it, because what we want is this portion of the text that we're reading is highlighted
Okay.
for this. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Just tell me when you want me to go.
Dale, you ready? You see the recording? And when you're ready, go ahead.
Okay. The problems with the theory that Facsimile 3 is the vignette from Book of the Dead 125 can most readily be shown by a single quotation from the latest known copy of the Book of the Dead written in Demotic in AD 63. This Book of the Dead has no vignettes. Instead, it has a written description of the vignettes demonstrating clearly what elements the Egyptians thought were essential in the judgment scene. The 42 gods, break, the Lord of the Spirit above the Hall of the True Truths, a figure of Hathor, Lady of the Underworld, carrying a wasp scepter, protecting the man, while the two arms of the scale are straight and Thoth is on its left, to the right of it's broken, while Horus speaks, and Anubis grasps it on the side on which are the two truths, while he is on opposite on the other side of the scale. Thoth reads the writing since a scroll is in his hand. Ahamit, in whose hand is a knife, and before whom are a sword and a scepter. Anubis holding his hand. A lotus with two supports on which are the four sons of Horus. A chapel on which Osiris sits on his throne, there being an offering table with a lotus before him. Isis is behind him praising, and Nephthys is behind him praising. A careful comparison of this description with actual vignettes of Book of the Dead 125 shows that the major elements are all in this picture. Here are the 42 gods. Here is the Hall of the Truths. This is the figure of the goddess holding a wasp scepter. Here is the man. The two arms of the scale are straight. Thoth is on the left of the scale. Horus has his hand raised in a gesture of speaking. Anubis is grasping the side of the scale in which the figure representing truth is seated. The man is shown placing his heart upon the scale. Thoth is shown reading or writing something. Ahamit is clearly present, and although this particular illustration omits the knife in his hand, it is shown on other copies of the same scene. The scepter is nearby. Here is the lotus with the four sons of Horus atop it. This is the chapel in which sits Osiris, with the offering table and lotus in front of him. In this particular scene, Isis and Nephthys are not standing behind him, but they are found on other scenes. If we compare this description with Facsimile 3, we find that the description does not match at all. Facsimile 3 lacks the 42 gods. It is missing Hathor holding the wasp scepter. There is no balance scale. Thoth is missing from the left-hand side of the non-existent scale. Horus is missing. The figure generally identified with Anubis is not grasping the side of the scale, but the waist of the man. Since Thoth is not depicted, he cannot be shown reading anything. Ahamit is absent, along with the knife, sword, and scepter. The lotus is missing the four sons of Horus atop it. Though Osiris is shown sitting, he is not depicted seated within any chapel. Almost all of the elements which the Egyptians thought were important for the scene are conspicuous by their absence from Facsimile 3. Significantly, these elements are present in a vignette accompanying Book of the Dead, chapter 125, found among the Joseph Smith papyri, as well as other copies of vignettes of the Book of the Dead 125. These elements are present in all the judgment scenes that the critics would compare with Facsimile 3. The elements of the judgment scene as listed in the Demotic Book of the Dead are consistent with those of earlier judgment scenes. Their absence from Facsimile 3 indicates that Facsimile 3 is not a judgment scene and is not directly associated with Book of the Dead 125. Far from being, as one critic claimed, the single most common form of Egyptian funerary scene known, which is not even true of Book of the Dead 125, the real parallels to Facsimile 3 have not yet been publicly identified. Having established what Facsimile 3 is not, however, we are free to look for those real parallels to Facsimile 3. Only after we have identified the real parallels to Facsimile 3 can we then determine what the Egyptians meant by them. And only at that point can any comparison with Joseph Smith's interpretation be considered meaningful or even valid.
Fade to black. Is that it?
That's it.
So what did you just told us?
When are we starting?
Starting on that camera.